For years, she was invisible. The kind of invisible that doesn't come from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who choose not to see you. The kind that settles into your bones until you begin to question whether you ever mattered at all. And on the night everything finally came undone, rain fell hard against the windows of a quiet suburban home in America, the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever seems out of place, where lawns are trimmed and smiles are rehearsed, where families look perfect from the outside. But inside that house, she sat in a corner while voices filled the room without ever reaching her. Conversations moved around her like she wasn't there. Decisions were made over her life without her input. And even when she spoke, no one really listened. Because over time they had learned something dangerous. They had learned that she would stay quiet, that she would endure, that she would accept being treated like nothing. And so they pushed further, dismissed her more openly, laughed a little louder at her expense, until her silence became their permission, and her presence became something they barely acknowledged anymore. But what none of them understood, what none of them even considered, was that silence does not mean ignorance, and being overlooked does not mean being unaware, because while they ignored her, she was watching, while they dismissed her, she was listening, and while they believed she had no power, she was slowly putting together pieces of a truth they never wanted uncovered, a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for years, buried beneath lies, manipulation, and the comfort of believing she would never speak up. But on that night, something shifted, something broke in a way that could not be repaired, and when she finally opened her mouth, it wasn't to defend herself or to beg for understanding. It was to reveal something that made the entire room fall silent, the kind of silence that doesn't come from respect but from fear, because in that moment, the woman they had spent years ignoring became the only person in that house who truly understood what was going on. And by the time they realized just how much she knew, it was already too late, because the truth, once spoken, does not go back into hiding, and what she revealed that night would not just change her life, it would unravel everything they had built, exposing secrets that were never meant to see the light of day, and forcing everyone in that room to confront a reality they had spent years trying to avoid. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story is not just about a woman who was ignored. It is about how easily people can overlook the one person who sees everything, and how dangerous that can become when the truth finally comes out. This is the story of a woman no one took seriously, a woman named Clara Mitchell, whose presence in her own home slowly faded into the background until it became convenient for everyone around her to pretend she had nothing worth saying. And for years that illusion held strong, supported by smiles and family photos that never quite reached the eyes, by quiet dinners where tension lingered just beneath the surface, by arguments that ended with slammed doors and long stretches of silence, the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. And if you looked closely enough, if you paid attention to the details most people ignored, you would begin to notice that something about the Mitchell household didn't quite add up, because behind every forced laugh and every carefully staged moment was a pattern, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once you saw it. A pattern of control, of exclusion, of decisions being made without Clara, about Clara, as though she were a problem to manage, rather than a person to understand. And yet for all the ways she was dismissed, Clara remained there, watching, listening, remembering, and the longer it went on, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about a strained relationship or a distant marriage. It was something deeper, something hidden beneath layers of routine and denial, something that had been carefully concealed not just from outsiders, but from Clara herself. Or at least that's what they believed, because the truth is, Clara knew more than they ever imagined. And the real question is why she stayed silent for so long. What kept her in a place where she was treated like she didn't exist? And what exactly she had discovered that made everything collapse in a single night? Because families don't just fall apart without reason, and secrets don't stay hidden forever. So why was Clara ignored? What were they hiding from her or about her? And what really happened the night everything fell apart? Because whatever it was, it didn't just change Clara's life. It changed everything connected to it. And to understand how it reached that point, to understand how someone can go from being invisible to becoming the center of something no one could control, we have to go back to the beginning. Clara Mitchell wasn't always invisible, and that is what makes her story so difficult to ignore, because there was a time when she had a voice that filled a room, when her laughter came easily and her opinions carried weight, when she believed her life would follow a path that made sense, one where she would be seen, heard, and valued. But somewhere along the way that version of Clara began to fade, not all at once, not in a way that anyone could easily point to, but slowly, almost quietly, until the woman who once had presence became someone people spoke over, interrupted, or simply overlooked entirely. And at the center of that shift was her husband, Daniel Mitchell, a man known in the community as dependable, successful, and respected, the kind of man neighbors trusted and colleagues admired, someone who carried himself with confidence and authority. And over time, that authority didn't just shape his public image, it shaped the dynamic inside his home, where his voice carried the final word, where his opinions became decisions, and where Clara's role gradually changed from partner to afterthought. And their children, growing up in that environment, learned quickly which voice mattered most, aligning themselves with their father's tone, his dismissiveness, his quiet control, until even they began to treat Clara as though she were someone to tolerate rather than someone to listen to. And to outsiders, the Mitchell family looked stable, even enviable, the kind of household that seemed to function without conflict. But behind closed doors, the reality was far more complicated, filled with small moments that added up over time. Moments where Clara's words were brushed aside, where her concerns were minimized, where her presence was acknowledged only when necessary. And yet through all of this, Clara remained observant, her silence never empty but filled with thought, with awareness, with questions she never voiced out loud, because while everyone around her assumed she had accepted her place, Clara was paying attention in ways they did not expect, noticing inconsistencies, remembering conversations, connecting details that didn't quite fit. And there were moments, brief and easy to miss, where her expression would change, where her eyes would linger just a little longer than usual, where it became clear that she was not as unaware as they believed. And those moments, though subtle, carried a weight that would only make sense later, because Clara wasn't just being ignored, she was being pushed aside, and not by accident, not by chance, but for a reason that had been carefully kept out of reach, a reason that, once revealed, would make everything that came before it impossible to see the same way again. Then came the night that changed everything, a night that at first felt no different from the many others that had come before it, where tension lingered just beneath the surface and conversations carried an edge that could turn sharp without warning. And as the rain pressed steadily against the windows of the Mitchell home, the air inside grew heavier with every passing moment, until what began as a simple disagreement between Clara Mitchell and Daniel Mitchell slowly escalated into something far more intense, voices rising, words overlapping, years of unspoken frustration finding their way into a single exchange that neither of them could fully control anymore. And as the argument spread through the house, their children stood nearby, caught between discomfort and familiarity, as though they had seen versions of this before, but never quite like this, because this time there was something different in the way Clara spoke, something steadier, something that didn't retreat the way it always had. And as Daniel's tone sharpened, his authority more pronounced than ever, expecting the same silence he had grown used to, Clara did something no one in that room was prepared for. She didn't step back, she didn't lower her voice, and she didn't disappear into the background. Instead, she held her ground in a way that immediately shifted the balance of the room. And in the middle of raised voices and the sharp sound of something breaking against the floor, a moment of stillness broke. Through the chaos, the kind of moment that feels almost unnatural, as though time itself hesitated. And in that space, Clara spoke, not loudly, not emotionally, but with a calm certainty that carried more weight than anything that had been said before it. And though her words were not shouted, they cut through the noise with precision, revealing just enough to change everything without explaining it all at once. And for a brief second no one moved. No one responded, because what she said didn't just challenge the argument. It challenged the foundation of everything they thought they understood. And as the room fell into silence, the kind of silence that settles when something irreversible has just been set into motion, it became clear that this was no longer just another argument, No longer just another night that would be forgotten by morning. Because whatever Clara had just revealed, whatever truth had finally made its way into the open, it was enough to make everyone in that room freeze, caught between disbelief and the growing realization that the woman they had ignored for so long had just taken control of a story they could no longer contain. Within hours, everything changed, the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood replaced by flashing lights and hushed conversations as police cars lined the street outside the Mitchell home, drawing attention from neighbors who had always believed they understood the family that lived there, neighbors who now stood at a distance, watching, whispering, trying to piece together what could have possibly happened behind doors that had always seemed so ordinary. And inside that house, the tension that had once been contained within private walls was now exposed, unfolding under the scrutiny of authorities who began asking questions that no one seemed fully prepared to answer. Because as statements were taken and timelines were discussed, something quickly became clear: the stories didn't match. Daniel Mitchell's account carried confidence, but lacked detail in places that should have been clear. The children repeated fragments that sounded rehearsed yet incomplete, and in the middle of it all was Clara Mitchell, no longer sitting quietly in the background, but now the focus of every conversation, every question, every glance. The woman no one had listened to suddenly becoming the one person everyone needed to hear from. And as investigators looked closer, small details began to surface: documents that had been overlooked, records that hinted at inconsistencies, moments from the past that now carried new meaning, including an incident that had once been dismissed as insignificant but now raised concerns when viewed through a different lens. And at first, it appeared to be nothing more than a domestic situation that had escalated too far, the kind of case that might resolve itself with enough explanation. But the deeper they looked, the more that explanation began to fall apart, because there were gaps that couldn't be ignored, patterns that didn't align, and a growing sense that something much larger had been hidden beneath years of routine and silence. And then there was Clara, calm in a way that didn't match the chaos around her, steady in a way that made it clear she had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone realized. Because while everyone else struggled to keep their version of events intact, Clara didn't need to adjust her story. She didn't need to search for answers. And when the time came for her to speak, she didn't just offer words. She presented something far more difficult to dismiss, something that shifted the direction of the entire investigation in an instant, because Clara had proof. For years, Clara Mitchell had been documenting everything, not in a way that drew attention, not in a way that anyone around her would ever notice, but quietly, patiently, collecting pieces of a reality that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge, saving messages, recording conversations, keeping copies of documents that didn't quite make sense at the time but felt important enough not to ignore. And as those pieces came together, a pattern began to form, one that pointed directly at Daniel Mitchell and a truth that had been hidden behind his reputation for far longer than anyone could have imagined. Because what Clara uncovered was not just dishonesty or small secrets. It was a long-term financial scheme that had been carefully constructed over the years, involving accounts no one else knew about, transactions that were disguised to appear legitimate, and decisions made in Clara's name without her knowledge or consent. Decisions that placed everything she had at risk while keeping her completely in the dark. And as investigators reviewed the evidence she provided, the scale of it became impossible to ignore. Every document connecting to another, every record confirming what had once seemed unthinkable. And suddenly the man who had always appeared in control was no longer the one guiding the narrative. Because the truth Clara revealed didn't just challenge his authority, it dismantled it entirely. And in that moment, as the reality of what had been hidden came into focus, the reactions around her said everything words could not. Shock giving way to panic, denial collapsing under the weight of proof that could no longer be explained away. Because the woman they had ignored for so long was the only one who truly understood what had been happening all along. The only one who had seen through the carefully maintained image and recognized the cracks beneath it. And in one moment, with everything laid out in front of them, everything they had built, every illusion they had maintained, every version of the truth they had relied on, collapsed in a way that could never be undone. In the end, Clara Mitchell didn't just reveal the truth. She exposed everyone who had underestimated her, not with anger or chaos, but with a quiet certainty that carried far more weight than anything they had ever dismissed before. Because as the investigation moved forward and the reality of Daniel Mitchell's actions became undeniable, the life that once looked so controlled and untouchable began to fall apart piece by piece, leaving behind a house that no longer felt like a home, a family, forced to confront not just what had been hidden from them, but what they had chosen not to see. And through it all, Clara remained steady, no longer pushed to the side, no longer overlooked, but finally seen for who she had been all along. Someone who endured, someone who paid attention, someone who refused to let the truth stay buried. And as she walked away from the life that had once confined her, there was no need for dramatic words or final confrontations, because everything that needed to be said had already been revealed. Everything that needed to change had already begun, and what remained was a silence very different from the one she had lived in before, a silence that now belonged to those left behind, those who had ignored the signs, dismissed the warnings, and believed that what they couldn't see wouldn't matter. But the real question is how many people saw the signs and chose to ignore them? How many moments were overlooked because it was easier than asking difficult questions? Because sometimes the truth is not hidden, it is simply ignored. And sometimes the person standing quietly in the corner is not powerless at all, but waiting, watching, understanding far more than anyone realizes. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should fear the most. What do you think really happened that night? Was Clara Mitchell simply a victim of years of silence and control, or was she something more than anyone ever realized? Someone who understood the truth long before anyone else and chose the exact moment to reveal it. Because stories like this are rarely as simple as they first appear, and sometimes the person at the center of it all is far more complex than the role they were given. So take a moment and let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd really like to hear your perspective on this. And if you think this story was shocking, if you thought you understood where it was going and then realized you didn't, just wait until you hear the next one. Because there are more stories like this, stories where the truth hides in plain sight and only reveals itself when it's too late to stop it. So make sure you subscribe and stay with us for more real-life twists you won't believe.